There are civilizations whose names echo across thousands of years, becoming symbols of human intellect and power: Egypt with its pyramids, Greece with its philosophy, and Rome with its mighty empire. But hidden between those familiar chapters of history lies another civilization, real, yet almost like a shadow. A people without land borders, without a vast standing army, yet they controlled the seas and wrote a glorious chapter in human history. They were the Phoenicians, masters of the oceans, merchants, inventors, and at the same time a people history nearly forgot. The Phoenicians did not leave behind great pyramids, they did not build temples of marble, they did not record epic tales on thousands of scrolls. What they left was a trade network that stretched across the Mediterranean, an alphabet that opened the path for Western writing, a royal purple dye that colored the robes of kings, and thriving port cities that once challenged the mightiest empires. So why did history quietly push them aside, leaving the name of Phoenicia to appear only in scattered lines of the Bible, in brief notes from Herodotus, or in broken pottery washed up on Mediterranean shores? Was it because they left no towering monuments? Or was it because their freedom, their decentralized way of life, made it difficult for later generations to define them as an empire? Or was there something else, a deliberate forgetting? In tonight's episode of Bedtime History, we will retrace the footsteps of this seafaring power that once controlled the trade routes of the ancient world. We will uncover stories buried by time and open a new perspective on human history, where the light of Phoenicia still shimmers across the waves of the Mediterranean Sea. To understand how a borderless people could become the commercial hub of the ancient world, we have to begin with the Levant, the modern name for the narrow strip of land along the eastern Mediterranean coast. In ancient texts, this land was known as Canaan. It was the natural crossroads between three great centers of civilization: to the south, Egypt with its fertile Nile Valley; to the east, Mesopotamia with the Tigris and Euphrates nourishing the first city-states; to the north, Anatolia rich in copper and iron; and to the west, the open sea leading to countless voyages. Nowhere else in the ancient Near East did so many routes and resources converge, and because of this, Canaan was never truly at peace. For millennia, it was a collision point where peoples, goods, languages, faiths, and invading armies all met, layering culture upon culture. By the 3rd millennium before Christ, the people of this land had already formed stable settlements. They grew barley and wheat on narrow plains, tended grapes and olives on the hillsides, herded goats and sheep, and harvested the famed cedar wood of Lebanon, a resource coveted by both Egypt and Mesopotamia. Byblos, the most prominent port in these early centuries, quickly became the bridge between Canaan and Egypt. From here, cedar and aromatic resins crossed the sea to the Nile, exchanged for gold, papyrus, and luxury goods. This role as intermediary laid the foundation for the commercial traditions of Phoenicia that would follow. Unlike Egypt or Mesopotamia, which were built upon the unifying power of great rivers, Canaan was fractured by mountains, bays, and small valleys. Its broken landscape made it nearly impossible for one central authority to dominate the whole region. Instead, each harbor and each valley grew into autonomous communities, sometimes allies, sometimes rivals, but all bound to the sea. This fragmentation soon gave rise to the port city model, the distinctive form of social organization that later defined the Phoenicians. Between 2000 and 1500 before Christ, waves of migration and conflict swept through the region. The Hyksos came down from the north only to be driven out by the pharaohs of Egypt, but not before leaving behind chariot technology and new weapons. The Amorites advanced from the desert, bringing Semitic language and religious influences. The Canaanites were never strong enough to resist outright, but they possessed a unique ability to absorb, adapt, and reshape. It was this flexibility that kept them from disappearing, allowing them to slowly forge their own identity. In this environment of constant exchange, the coastal Canaanites gradually became middlemen. They learned many languages, grew accustomed to using different measures and weights, and mastered the craft of producing purple dye from the murex shellfish. They shipped cedar wood across the seas and returned with gold, silver, pearls, and fine textiles. Each trading voyage was more than an exchange of goods, it was also an accumulation of culture. Over time, the coastal communities grew apart from inland Canaan and developed a distinctly maritime identity. Later, the Greeks would call them Phoenix, the purple-red people, a name tied to their famous Tyrian dye. That name did not exist in this pre-Phoenician stage, but the seeds were already planted, a small, adaptable community, living by the sea and by trade, surviving through diplomacy and skill. Looking back, this pre-Phoenician era was a trial by fire. Narrow lands forced them to look outward to the sea. The pressure of vast empires forced them to master the art of diplomacy. The fragmented geography forced them to embrace the model of port cities. Together, these elements set the stage for the rise of one of history's most unique maritime civilizations. After the waves of migration and conquest during the Hyksos period, 3 urban centers along the Levantine coast began to take shape: Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre. They were not capitals of a single unified kingdom, but shining nodes in a chain of autonomous ports, bound together by a shared destiny to live by the sea and to reach out to the sea in order to survive. Byblos is often considered the oldest port city in the region, with a history of trade deeply intertwined with Egypt since the 3rd millennium before Christ. Cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon was shipped from Byblos down to the Nile, where it became columns in the temples of Karnak, beams in the tombs of the Valley of the Kings, or planks in the warships of the pharaohs. In return came papyrus, gold, lapis lazuli, and luxuries unknown in the Levant. That bond lasted so long that the name Byblos in Greek later became synonymous with the word book, because it was here that Egyptian papyrus was re-exported across the region. Through its role as a cultural bridge, Byblos became a symbol, a mediator city, a place where civilizations did not meet face to face, but met through the hands of Phoenician merchants. Sidon, to the south of Byblos, had a different character: dynamic, pragmatic, and endlessly inventive. During the 2nd millennium before Christ, Sidon rose to prominence through its glass workshops. Fragments of green and deep blue glass, melted in Sidonian furnaces, have been found in Egyptian tombs and Mesopotamian palaces. Sidon was also the launch point for overseas trade expeditions carrying wine, olive oil, fine textiles, and exquisite jewelry. Its geography was ideal, a flat coastline where ships could easily dock, making Sidon a crossroads for every direction of commerce. Archaeologists have uncovered Mesopotamian cylinder seals, Egyptian amulets, and Anatolian pottery in the same layers of soil. This shows that Sidon was not only a trading hub, but also a place of convergence, where artistic styles and religious beliefs from many civilizations blended together in small but finely crafted objects. Tyre, farther south, was something else entirely. Built on an island of rock a kilometer offshore, it gleamed like a jewel hidden in the waves. That location gave Tyre a natural defensive advantage few ports could match. Any invader had to cross the sea and face sheer walls rising from the cliffs. This isolation fostered Tyre's fierce pride and independence. During Egypt's New Kingdom, Tyre was initially drawn into the pharaoh's orbit, sending cedar, purple dye, and crafted goods as tribute in exchange for protection. But gradually its natural advantages and its hunger for autonomy pushed Tyre beyond dependence, allowing it to emerge as a commercial and military powerhouse. Before long, Tyre would become the beating heart of Phoenicia, the cradle of naval strength and colonial ambition. The relationship with New Kingdom Egypt was decisive for all three cities. After defeating the Hyksos, pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II marched into Canaan, forcing Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre into submission. Yet submission did not mean total dependence. Egypt needed cedar wood for shipbuilding and skilled craftsmen for luxury goods, while the Phoenicians needed grain, precious metals, and papyrus from the Nile Valley. This was a relationship that was both political and economic, where each side supplied what the other could not. Through it, the Phoenician ports gained diplomatic experience, commercial capital, and above all, ever greater mastery of the sea. By the end of the second millennium before Christ, Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre had become the three jewels of Phoenicia, each shining with its own hue. Byblos represented deep history and cultural mediation. Sidon embodied the vibrant pulse of trade and invention. Tyre stood as an island fortress, preparing to rise as a center of power. Seen together, Phoenicia was not a centralized empire like Egypt or Assyria, but more like a symphony of independent port cities, each its own instrument, blending together with the sound of the waves to create the unique music of a civilization. From this foundation, the true Phoenician identity emerged. And to understand the heartbeat of this maritime world more deeply, we must look into daily life, family, work, and faith, where the sea was not only a place of survival, but the very soul of the community. Behind the bustling ports of Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, the daily life of the early Phoenicians was marked by simplicity, endurance, and steady rhythm. They did not build palaces as magnificent as the pharaohs, nor did they possess hanging gardens like the Babylonians. Their society was woven from small families bound to traditional crafts, fishing, shipbuilding, weaving, and the famous purple dyeing. The clang of hammers in cedar workshops, the sharp scent of salt from newly docked ships, the incense rising from a modest temple at the heart of the city. All of it blended into the pulse of everyday life, both diligent and deeply connected. The most familiar sight in this world was the line of wooden ships anchored along the harbors. Men set out to fish or prepared for long-distance voyages, carrying timber, textiles, oil, and precious purple dye. Nearly every family had someone tied to the sea, whether sailor, merchant, or shipbuilder. Those who stayed behind worked the narrow plots of land beyond the city, tending vines, olives, and barley, or journeyed into the Lebanese mountains to cut cedar wood. Homes were built of rubble stone and mud brick, roofed with timber and palm leaves. Inside, though modest, one might still find refined objects, painted pottery, fragments of purple-dyed cloth, or small ornaments of bronze and glass, proof of wide-ranging connections. Family was the basic unit of society, but it was never closed off. Trade meant every household extended beyond its own walls. A man might be gone for months on a distant journey, leaving his wife and children to manage the land or the workshop. As a result, Phoenician women often held responsibilities beyond the household. In fact, archaeologists have found women's names inscribed on seals and clay tablets as owners or managers, evidence of their significant role in society, something rare in many civilizations of the time. Alongside the merchants, artisans held a crucial place. The Phoenicians were famed for their skill, from colored glass and fine jewelry to carved ivory imported from Africa. These were not only for local use but also became major exports. Above all, the craft of producing Tyrian purple was both pride and burden. From thousands of murex shells, workers extracted tiny drops of dye, a grueling process with a pungent stench, but yielding a color so rare that only kings could wear it. Possessing this secret was a source of wealth and prestige. Meanwhile, shipbuilders commanded equal respect, for without their craft neither trade nor naval expeditions could exist. Merchants and artisans lived side by side with farmers, fishermen, and laborers. On the terraced slopes, people planted barley, pressed olive oil, and harvested grapes for wine. Agriculture alone did not bring great wealth, but it provided food security and goods for exchange. Social divisions in Phoenicia were therefore less harsh than in centralized empires, shaped more by one's role in trade. Those tied more closely to the sea prospered, while those rooted to the land lived simply. Above all, spiritual life revolved around local deities. Each city had its own patron god or goddess. Byblos worshipped Baalat-Gebel, Sidon honored Astarte, goddess of love and war, while Tyre revered Melkart, protector of voyages, later equated by the Greeks with Heracles. Phoenician temples were not massive like Egypt's pyramids, but they stood at the heart of community life. Here, people offered prayers before sailing, sought safety after storms, and gave thanks for safe return. Rituals ranged from simple offerings of incense and flowers to elaborate sacrifices, sometimes even of animals. Their religion was one of fusion. Canaanite traditions blended with Egyptian and Mesopotamian symbols, reflecting the Phoenicians' distinctive ability to integrate cultures. Taken as a whole, early Phoenician society did not appear as a mighty empire, but rather as a colorful mosaic: small seaside houses, busy workshops, crowded harbors, and smoke rising from sacred altars. A small yet adaptable people, where farmers, artisans, and merchants together formed a symphony of the sea. From this humble foundation, Phoenicia forged its identity, not by the sword, but by skilled hands, trade, and the belief that the sea was the very soul of their existence. When we speak of Phoenicia, we cannot separate it from the sea. For many ancient peoples, the sea was a wall of separation, a natural boundary that discouraged them from venturing too far. But for the Phoenicians, the sea was a road, an endless field where life could be sown, a mirror reflecting the destiny of an entire community. If the land was narrow, fragmented, and vulnerable to invasion, the sea was vast, boundless, and full of opportunities for survival and growth. As early as the 14th to 12th centuries before Christ, records already praised the Phoenicians for their mastery of seafaring. They did not just sail along the shoreline, they dared to leave sight of land, cross treacherous straits, and reach distant islands. To achieve this, they built a treasury of nautical knowledge that astonished later generations. One of their most important secrets was their ability to read the skies. The Phoenicians learned to navigate by the stars, especially the one the Greeks would later call Polaris, the North Star. When darkness fell and the coastline disappeared, the heavens became a living map. By measuring the star's height above the horizon, Phoenician sailors could estimate their position and maintain a steady course for days and nights on end. Even Greek authors admitted this with a simple phrase: the Phoenicians sail by the stars. But navigation alone was not enough. They also had to master the art of shipbuilding. From the cedar of Lebanon, a wood prized for its fragrance, strength, and resistance to decay, Phoenician ships were born. At first, they built long, slender vessels powered mainly by oars, but by this time they had added square sails, harnessing the wind to spare human labor and increase speed. Some ships were broad and sturdy, built to carry heavy cargoes of timber, wine, oil, and metals. Others were smaller and swifter, meant for short trading routes or reconnaissance. Their plank-joining technology was particularly advanced. Instead of relying only on metal nails, they used wooden pegs and ropes, which gave the hulls greater flexibility and resilience against rough seas. This method later influenced Greek and Roman shipbuilding. Such craftsmanship allowed Phoenician vessels to reach far beyond the horizons of their contemporaries. The sea shaped not only their technology but also their spirit. Phoenician children grew up watching fathers mend nets, tie sails, or carve sacred symbols into a ship's prow. Women grew accustomed to seeing husbands and sons depart for months, whispering prayers to Melkart or Astarte for their safe return. Maritime experience seeped into their language, their rituals, and their daily habits. For them, the sea was not a threat, but a natural extension of the land. The sea was not merely a backdrop, it was destiny. It taught the Phoenicians patience while waiting for wind, creativity in designing ships, and adaptability when negotiating with foreign traders. It opened a unique path of development separate from civilizations rooted in rivers and farmland. From it, Phoenicia forged its identity. A civilization almost invisible in the history of land empires, yet indispensable in the Mediterranean network, a civilization of waves, of stars, and of people who saw the sea as their soul. Amid the long voyages across the waves and the endless negotiations at Mediterranean harbors, the Phoenicians came to realize a pressing need. Spoken words and the complex writing systems borrowed from their neighbors were no longer enough to keep up with the speed of trade. Merchants needed quick records, artisans needed to mark their products, and sailors needed to know where goods were headed and who they belonged to. A new tool had to be created, something simpler, more practical, and most importantly, portable. Out of that need came one of the most revolutionary inventions in human history, the Phoenician alphabet. Before this, the world knew two great writing systems, Egyptian hieroglyphs and Mesopotamian cuneiform. Both were magnificent but also heavy and complex. Each system contained hundreds, sometimes thousands of signs, some representing ideas, others sounds, requiring years of study to master. Writing was therefore tied to elites, priests, officials, and scribes of the palace. But for a commercial society like Phoenicia, where every transaction demanded speed and precision, such elaborate scripts were an obstacle. The Phoenicians chose a different path. They stripped writing down to its roots. They observed, borrowed from earlier systems, and then created a set of just 22 symbols, each one representing a basic sound. No more hundreds of pictorial signs, no more complicated blends of meaning and sound. Each Phoenician letter was a sign for a sound, and with only a couple dozen symbols to learn, anyone could read and write. This was a turning point. Writing was no longer the monopoly of the elite. It spread to merchants, artisans, and even ordinary sailors. This simplicity made the alphabet the most flexible tool the world had ever seen. On voyages to Cyprus, Egypt, or Greece, Phoenician merchants could quickly jot notes, carve names, or mark their cargo. The alphabet traveled with their ships, spreading like an invisible tide across the Mediterranean. The Greeks adopted it, adding vowels to suit their language. The Romans inherited it and carried it further still. Nearly every Western alphabet today, from Latin to its modern descendants, can trace its roots back to the Phoenician seed. Remarkably, this alphabet was born in a time of chaos. Around 1200 before Christ, the late Bronze Age collapse toppled many empires and shattered old trade networks. In this turmoil, the Phoenician script proved to be the perfect tool of adaptation. It required no massive bureaucracy to maintain, only memory and daily practice. And so, while other civilizations fell into disorder, the Phoenicians carved a new path, practical, light, and enduring. Archaeology has uncovered traces of Phoenician writing carved into stone at Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre, then spreading to Cyprus, Malta, Carthage, and even the Iberian Peninsula. An inscribed shard at Kition in Cyprus, a stele at Nora in Sardinia, and letters at Cadiz in Spain all testify that this humble script travelled wherever Phoenician merchants went. Each character carved into stone, metal, or pottery was proof that the Phoenicians were not just traders, but reformers of knowledge. The Phoenician alphabet was therefore more than a tool for memory. It was a symbol of practicality and creativity. It pulled writing out of temples and palaces and set it on the decks of ships. into trade ledgers, and into the hands of ordinary people. With this invention, the Phoenicians forever changed the way humanity records and shares ideas. After the alphabet was born, a tool both light and practical, designed to record transactions and connect merchants, Phoenicia entered the most dazzling phase of its early commercial expansion. From around 1200 to 1000 before Christ, while the old Mediterranean order wavered in the chaos of the late Bronze Age collapse, the Phoenician port cities seized the opportunity to push outward, building a network of exchange that stretched from the Levant all the way to the shores of the Atlantic. Ships from Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, laden with cedar wood, glass, textiles, and Tyrian purple, sailed to Cyprus to trade for copper, stopped in Crete for pottery, crossed to Greece for wine and olive oil, then pressed farther west to Sicily and Sardinia. At each stop, they did not simply trade and leave. They established way stations, part warehouse, part shelter for sailors, part seed for future colonies. Cyprus was their first decisive step. The island was rich in copper ore, essential for bronze production. Archaeological remains there show Phoenician pottery, architecture, and inscriptions, proving they left more than fleeting footprints. They left lasting communities. In Sicily and Sardinia, Phoenician ceramics appear in native soil layers, alongside seals carved with tiny inscriptions, clear signs of enduring presence. Phoenicia thus became the bridge linking the central Mediterranean with resource-rich frontiers. What set them apart was their method of expansion. The Phoenicians rarely relied on force. They did not march like the Assyrians, nor carve out territorial empires like Egypt. They arrived with goods and agreements. A single handshake with a local chief could open an entire island to trade. Their presence sparked little conflict because they demanded no land, only harbors. Commerce was their weapon, and their network of exchange was the invisible empire they ruled. This expansion quickly enriched their cities. Harbors grew crowded, warehouses overflowed with ivory from Africa, amber from the north, gold from Egypt, and tin from distant lands. Phoenician merchants, once mere intermediaries, now became indispensable to the regional economy. Prosperity showed itself in temple architecture, in fine jewelry, in religious ceremonies that grew ever more elaborate, acts of gratitude to the gods for safe voyages across dangerous seas. More importantly, this era revealed Phoenicia's extraordinary gift for adaptation. As Mycenaean Greece collapsed, the Hittites in Anatolia fell, and Egypt faltered under the assault of the Sea Peoples. Phoenicia rose. They were not bound to a single river valley or grain supply, so when one trade route broke down, they quickly opened another. This flexibility made them the true survivors of a turbulent age. The century between 1200 and 1000 before Christ became the foundation for Phoenicia's rise. They proved that without great armies and without vast territories, it was still possible to control a world through skill in trade, mastery of the sea, and the power to connect across borders. Out of this process, one product would soon emerge as the eternal symbol of Phoenician power. Tyrian purple, the color forever tied to their very name in history. The Greeks called them Phoenices, the people of the red purple, a name that referred to their unique dye extracted from the murex sea snail. The process was painstaking. Thousands of shells had to be cracked open to harvest a tiny gland within. When exposed to sunlight, the pale liquid slowly turned green, then deepened into a brilliant crimson purple. Just a small amount was enough to dye cloth in a color so rich and durable that it never faded with time. Because it was so rare and costly, Tyrian purple quickly became a symbol of power, reserved for kings, priests, and the ruling elite. Centuries later, in the Roman Empire, strict laws would declare that only the emperor himself could wear this shade. All of it began in the reeking dye workshops of Tyre, where Phoenician craftsmen quietly produced a color that would live forever in history. But purple gold was not the only product that made the Phoenicians famous. Cedar wood from the mountains of Lebanon was another strategic export. These trees grew tall, fragrant, and strong, and were almost impervious to rot. Another prized craft was glass making. From sand, fire, and secret mixtures, Phoenician artisans created clear glass and shimmering colored pieces. They exported cups, bowls, beads, and even raw glass blocks for others to work. To the ancient world, glass was both a useful material and a luxury ornament. Archaeological finds in Egypt, Greece, and as far as the Iberian Peninsula reveal how widely Phoenician glass was valued, proof of their far-reaching trade. And the list went on. Great jars of wine, olive oil from coastal groves, jewelry of gold and silver, ivory carved with exquisite detail, and amber from the distant north. The Phoenicians were not only selling their own goods but also acting as global middlemen. They bought tin from Cornwall and ivory from Africa, then redistributed them throughout the Mediterranean. In this way, Phoenician ports became nothing less than giant marketplaces, where goods from every direction converged and then spread again across the ancient world. Yet these commodities carried more than material value, they carried meaning. Tyrian purple stood for authority. Cedar symbolized endurance and the sacred. Glass reflected both light and the refinement of art. Through such goods, the Phoenicians not only gained wealth, but also carved their identity into the memory of civilization. In every product we glimpse the Phoenician spirit, practical yet refined, rooted in the sea, and skilled at turning simple resources into symbols of power. Thanks to this, their trade network kept expanding, and their diplomacy with surrounding empires grew stronger. For to sustain such prosperity, Phoenicia needed more than goods. It needed finesse, the delicate balance of power amid the great empires struggling for control of the Mediterranean. For centuries, Egypt had been the undisputed master of the Eastern Mediterranean. Under New Kingdom pharaohs like Thutmose III and Ramses II, mighty armies swept through Canaan, stamping their power on the Phoenician port cities. Byblos, Sidon, and Tyre were forced to send tribute, cedar wood, purple dye, and luxury goods in exchange for protection from the Nile Valley. Egypt's fleet dominated the seas, carrying gold from Nubia, incense from Punt, and goods from Canaan back to Memphis and Thebes. In this picture, Phoenicia was little more than a satellite, a warehouse supplying the empire beyond the desert. But in the 12th century before Christ, the balance of power began to shift. The late Bronze Age collapse shook the region. Wars with the Sea Peoples drained Egypt, while famine and internal strife weakened the dynasty after Ramses III. The once great Egyptian fleet no longer had the strength to control far-reaching trade routes. Meanwhile, the Phoenicians, already practiced in the role of intermediaries, found space to move in. As Egypt lost its dominance at sea, the Phoenician cities quickly stepped forward to take their place. Byblos, once called the gateway of cedar for Egypt, now expanded its dealings elsewhere, becoming an independent supplier. Sidon and Tyre, with sturdy fleets and wide networks, pushed farther than ever, reaching Cyprus, Crete, Anatolia, and even the distant Iberian coast. Ironically, as Egypt weakened, its need for Phoenician goods grew. Caravans of Phoenician merchants delivered papyrus, ivory, and gold, items once considered Egyptian specialties, but now under Phoenician control, with Phoenician hands setting the prices and directing the rhythm of exchange. In inscriptions and carvings that survive, Phoenicians begin to appear not as subjects, but as military allies and hired sailors for Egypt. No longer ruled, they had become indispensable partners. At times, pharaohs relied on Phoenician fleets to maintain trade and even to carry out military campaigns. It was a silent but profound reversal. The former vassals had become the very extension of Egyptian power that Egypt could not live without. The consequences went beyond economics and left deep cultural marks. The Phoenicians absorbed Egyptian art and religious symbols, but no longer as passive borrowers. The goddess Astarte was shaped in the image of Isis. Melkart was linked to Osiris. The lotus flower and the protective eye were adopted into Phoenician design. But now it was selective, deliberate, a process in which Phoenicia transformed Egyptian elements into pieces of its own identity. As the new kingdom of Egypt declined, Phoenicia gradually replaced it at sea. The trade routes, once bright with Egyptian sails, were now filled with Phoenician ships. While Egypt turned inward, Phoenicia asserted itself as the maritime power, controlling the commercial arteries that tied east to west. This was a turning point. From dependency, Phoenicia had risen to become the commercial hub of the Mediterranean. Yet that very vacuum of power also placed them in the sights of new empires rising in the north, Assyria and Babylon. From this point onward, Phoenicia entered a new chapter, prosperous through trade, but constantly tested by the pressure of powerful states on land. When Egypt weakened and nearly withdrew from the stage of the Mediterranean, the order of the East was quickly reshaped. From Mesopotamia, Assyria rose like a storm of iron, bringing with it war chariots, disciplined armies, and colossal monuments carved to celebrate conquest. For most peoples of the region, the arrival of Assyria meant subjugation and the loss of independence, but for Phoenicia, the story was not simply one of defeat. They had no army strong enough to resist, yet they never accepted becoming slaves. With skill and subtlety they found a path, tribute in exchange for peace, and trade in exchange for prosperity. By the 9th century before Christ, Assyrian inscriptions begin to mention Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos as cities compelled to pay tribute. Kings like Ashurnasirpal II, Shalmaneser III, and Tiglath-Pileser III boasted that they forced Phoenicia to hand over gold, silver, cedarwood, purple dye, and luxury goods. On palace walls in Nimrud and Nineveh, we see Phoenician envoys kneeling, offering gifts before the throne. To Assyria, this was proof of their unmatched power. But behind these triumphant words, the reality was far more nuanced. Phoenician cities retained a surprising degree of autonomy, and most importantly, they never surrendered their control over maritime trade. The reason was simple. Assyria was a military empire, but its military power depended on logistics. Their endless campaigns and monumental projects required cedar for building, copper and tin for weapons, gemstones and ivory to display authority. These resources were scarce in Assyria itself, but Phoenicia was the hub that gathered them from across the Mediterranean. In other words, Assyria might demand tribute, but they themselves relied on the Phoenician network to survive. This was the gap the Phoenicians exploited, offering tribute to buy peace while quietly growing richer and extending their reach far beyond the grasp of Nineveh. Tyre was the prime example. Its island position allowed it to resist direct conquest again and again. Even when besieged and forced to pay tribute, Tyre kept its fleet, continued to dominate trade, and even founded colonies in the west, such as Kition on Cyprus, and trading stations along the coast of Spain. On Assyrian inscriptions, Tyre might be listed as subdued, but in reality, the city was never fully conquered. Sidon and Byblos chose a gentler approach. They offered gold, silver, and jewels in exchange for safety. Their harbors stayed lively, Phoenician ships sailed in and out without harassment. While many lands were reduced to Assyrian provinces, the Phoenician cities largely maintained their status as autonomous vassals. From this perspective, Phoenicia was not weak, but masterful in diplomacy. They understood that swords and spears were useless against Assyria, so they adopted another strategy, bowing politically in order to stand tall economically. Tribute was the price of peace, but commerce was the true foundation of Phoenician strength. Thanks to this delicate balance, Phoenicia endured from the 9th to the 7th centuries before Christ, a time when many other peoples were crushed beneath the wheels of Assyria. They not only survived but expanded their trade, laying the groundwork for the rise of Carthage in the west. Once again, Phoenicia proved that real power does not always come from weapons, but from resilience and wisdom in commanding the sea. If Phoenicia's relationship with Assyria revealed their political skill in paying tribute while maintaining trade, then their ties with Babylon, and especially with the Kingdom of Israel, unveil another dimension: cultural, religious, and symbolic connections recorded directly in the Bible. From the 9th to the 7th centuries before Christ, amid waves of political upheaval, Tyre, the jewel of Phoenicia, stood out through the name of one remarkable king, Hiram, a figure both historical and legendary. According to the Hebrew Bible, King Hiram I of Tyre, who ruled around 969 to 936 before Christ, was a close ally of King David and later of Solomon. When Solomon prepared to build the great temple in Jerusalem, he turned to Hiram. Tyre supplied cedar and cypress from Lebanon, along with master craftsmen, builders, and stonecutters. In return, Solomon sent grain, olive oil, wine, and silver. This exchange was described not as mere commerce, but as a sacred covenant. The Temple of Solomon, the most important religious monument of ancient Israel, was built with Phoenician materials and Phoenician hands. This engraved Phoenicia's name deep into religious memory. In the books of Kings, in Chronicles, and throughout later Jewish and Christian tradition, Tyre and Hiram are remembered. Hiram was not just a foreign king, but a collaborator who helped raise Israel's holiest sanctuary. The figure of Hiram Abiff, the Phoenician craftsman who fashioned the temple's metalwork, later became a legendary figure in Freemasonry, an emblem of hidden wisdom and sacrifice. Yet the relationship between Israel and Phoenicia was not entirely one of light. In the Bible, the Phoenicians appear with two faces. On one hand, they were allies, brothers of the sea. On the other, they were condemned for worshipping Baal and Astarte. The story of Queen Jezebel, daughter of King Ithobal of Sidon, who married King Ahab of Israel, became a symbol of religious conflict. She brought the worship of Baal into Israel, clashing with the Hebrew prophets. Jezebel was depicted as the embodiment of corruption, but in truth, her tale reflects the clash between Phoenicia's polytheism and Israel's emerging monotheism. At the same time, Phoenicia faced Babylon, the power that would eventually replace Assyria in Mesopotamia. Babylon, especially under Nebuchadnezzar II in the 6th century before Christ, was both feared and alluring. While wary of Babylonian armies, the Phoenicians still kept commerce alive. Cedarwood, glass, and purple dye continued to flow east, exchanged for grain, metals, and precious stones. These trade routes turned Phoenicia into a bridge. On one side, the Mediterranean and Egypt. On the other, the fertile plains of Mesopotamia. Archaeology confirms that this exchange was not confined to sacred texts. Phoenician goods have been found in Babylon, while Babylonian artistic and symbolic influences appear in Phoenician jewelry, seals, and rituals. This shows that the relationship was more than political or economic. It was a true cultural blending. Through their ties with both Israel and Babylon, Phoenicia etched itself deeply into the memory of history and religion. Few peoples are mentioned so often in the Bible, sometimes praised, sometimes condemned. When praised, they were loyal allies who helped build Jerusalem's temple. When condemned, they were sinful Sidon, bearers of foreign gods. But whether in admiration or reproach, their presence reveals one undeniable truth. Phoenicia was not on the margins, but at the very center of the ancient Near East. This paradox, both cooperation and conflict, both closeness and rejection, is what makes the Phoenician legacy unique. They were not merely invisible merchants, they were actors named in the most sacred texts, where history and faith intertwined, leaving a mark far beyond their own borders. If trade goods, writing, and seafaring skill were the tangible legacy of Phoenicia, then religion and belief were the mirror reflecting their inner spiritual life. At the harbours of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, incense smoke rose from small temples, where the Phoenicians poured their hopes, fears, and gratitude into gods they saw in the storms, the rains, and the harvests. These gods did not remain confined to Phoenician cities. They crossed the sea, reached Greece and Carthage, and left their imprint even on later religions. At the heart of the Phoenician pantheon was Baal. In the Semitic tongue, the word simply meant lord or master. Baal was not a single god, but a title for many local deities. In Tyre and Sidon, Baal was often linked to storms and rain, the forces that determined survival through the harvest. He was usually depicted as a warrior lifting a thunderbolt, an image strikingly similar to Zeus in Greek mythology. The resemblance was no accident. When the Greeks encountered the Phoenicians, they identified Baal with Zeus, proof of Phoenicia's deep cultural influence. Alongside Baal stood Astarte, goddess of love, fertility, and war. She descended from Mesopotamian Ishtar, but in Phoenicia she took on a form of her own, alluring yet fearsome, symbolizing both creation and destruction. Small clay figurines of women with wide eyes and full breasts have been found across Phoenician sites, showing that Astarte was a household presence, a personal protector. The Greeks later equated Astarte with Aphrodite, goddess of love, allowing a piece of Phoenician spirit to flow into Greek myth. Especially in Tyre, the god Melkart, king of the city, held a central role. Melkart was both guardian deity and symbol of power and rebirth. His cycle of death in the dry season and resurrection in the rains reflected the natural rhythm of life. When Phoenicia founded Carthage in North Africa, Melkart was carried with them, becoming the supreme god of Carthage. To the Greeks, Melkart resembled Heracles, their great hero. The two figures merged, and when Heracles became a universal symbol in Greco-Roman culture, the shadow of Melkart still lingered behind him. Beyond these three great figures, Phoenician religion included Dagon, god of agriculture, and the sea, Eshmun, god of healing, later identified with Asclepius, and many other local gods. Each city might have its own protector, but Phoenician belief was fluid and adaptive. They freely adopted deities from Egypt and Mesopotamia, reshaping them into forms that fit their own lives. Phoenician religion was not confined to temple rituals, it was woven into daily life. Before setting sail, sailors made offerings for protection. On returning safely, they gave thanks with wine, incense, or animal sacrifice. Greek and Roman sources even describe child sacrifice to Baal or Melkart during times of crisis. This remains controversial. Some scholars accept it as fact, others see it as exaggeration, even hostile propaganda by Rome against its enemy, Carthage. True or not, these accounts reveal the fierce intensity of Phoenician faith. The influence of Phoenician belief spread far beyond their homeland. From Carthage to Spain, from Greece to Rome, their gods appeared under new names, yet kept their essence. Baal, Astarte, and Melkart were not merely the gods of a small coastal people, but part of the great chain of Mediterranean myth. Equally important, in Phoenicia religion was never separate from commerce. Temples were not only houses of prayer, but also centers of finance, places to store wealth, seal contracts, even lend money. Here, economy and faith blended, showing the Phoenician spirit of practicality and flexibility, where seafaring and religion were bound tightly together. Because of this, Phoenician belief was both diverse and enduring, spreading and transforming without ever fading. From carved reliefs and jewelry to the patterns on pottery, all told a single story. Phoenicia conquered not only with goods and ships, but also with myth and faith, an invisible legacy carried forever on the waves. Unlike civilizations that raised towering monuments to display power, Phoenician art often lived in smaller, more delicate forms: a ceramic jar, a gold ring, an ivory relief. At first glance they may seem simple, yet within them lies an entire world of exchange, where Egyptian, Mesopotamian, and Greek motifs blended together, reshaped by Phoenician hands into a language of their own. Pottery came first. Phoenician kilns produced everything from everyday vessels to luxury wares. Their jars, amphorae, and plates ranged from plain, glazed designs to elaborate pieces adorned with lotus flowers and falcons from Egypt, the Mesopotamian tree of life, or spiraling waves borrowed from Greece. Many of these ceramics have been found in Cyprus, Sicily, and as far west as southern Spain. They prove that the Phoenicians were not merely passing traders, but craftsmen who helped establish a distinctive fusion style, easily recognizable in archaeology today. Even more striking was their jewelry. With access to gold, silver, tin, ivory, gemstones, and amber through their vast trade networks, Phoenician artisans created intricate bracelets, necklaces, and earrings. Many were adorned with four-petal rosettes or crescent moons. These pieces were not only beautiful, but carried a sense of mystery, and they were prized by elites from Egypt to Iberia. Archaeological excavations of noble tombs across the Mediterranean have uncovered Phoenician jewelry, testimony to its cross-cultural allure. Reliefs and carved ivory stood out as well. In the Assyrian palaces of Nimrud and Nineveh, countless ivory plaques, commissioned from Phoenician artisans, once decorated the walls. Sphinxes, lions, and lotus blossoms appear again and again, yet rendered with a style and technique uniquely their own. These works reveal Phoenician artists as both creators and cultural intermediaries, transmitting aesthetics between the great civilizations of their age. Religious imagery also entered their art: ships carved onto seals, coins stamped with guardian deities, and tiny amulets all reflected both the spirit of the sea and the blending of beliefs, but expressed through artistic form rather than ritual alone. What makes Phoenician art most captivating is its openness. They did not confine themselves to one style, but absorbed freely lotus flowers and sphinxes from Egypt, the tree of life from Mesopotamia, and the idealized human form from Greece. Yet through Phoenician hands, all of these became refined works familiar to customers across the Mediterranean. Their art, like their trade, was not about imposing power, it was about making connections. And from this spirit of fusion, the Phoenicians left more than small, beautiful objects. They planted seeds that would grow into Greek mythology, Roman art, and the civilization of Carthage. In the treasury of ancient records, the Phoenicians often appear as those willing to sail farther than anyone else of their time. Their name became inseparable from trade routes that crossed the Mediterranean, and sometimes from journeys that seemed impossible, sailing around Africa, reaching Cornwall in search of tin, and even, according to some theories, crossing the Atlantic itself. Whether recorded in direct accounts or preserved only in legend, these voyages reveal a rare trait. The Phoenicians transformed the sea not only into a highway of commerce, but into a stage for some of humanity's earliest feats of navigation. One of the most remarkable stories was recorded by Herodotus in the 5th century before Christ. Around 600 before Christ, Pharaoh Necho II of Egypt is said to have hired Phoenician sailors to attempt a circumnavigation of Africa. The fleet set out from the Red Sea, sailed southward, rounded the southern tip of the continent, and returned north along the western coast, finally re-entering the Mediterranean through the Strait of Gibraltar. The journey lasted 3 years, and to survive, the sailors would land, plant crops, harvest food, and then set sail again. The most striking detail from their account was that they claimed to have seen the sun to the north, something the Greeks considered absurd, but which we now know to be true when traveling in the southern hemisphere. That single detail has convinced many modern scholars that the voyage truly happened. If so, it was one of the earliest great maritime achievements in human history, centuries before Europeans first rounded Africa. Farther to the northwest, the Phoenicians are believed to have reached Cornwall in southwestern Britain, home to the famous tin mines. Tin was essential for making bronze, and during the Bronze Age demand was immense. The Greek historian Diodorus Siculus, writing in the 1st century before Christ, recounted that Phoenician merchants travelled as far as the British Isles to obtain tin, then carried it back to the Mediterranean through Gaul. The secrecy of this trade was so fierce that one tale claims a Phoenician captain, pursued by a Roman ship, deliberately wrecked his own vessel on the rocks to keep the route hidden, later receiving full compensation from the state for his sacrifice. Even a single anecdote like this shows how determined they were to protect their commercial monopoly. Beyond this lies the realm of legend. Could the Phoenicians have crossed the Atlantic? Some Phoenician coins have allegedly been found in the Americas, though their authenticity is hotly debated. A few indigenous traditions in Central and South America speak of people who came from the sea, wearing purple cloaks and sailing large ships, details that some have linked to Phoenician traders. While no conclusive archaeological evidence has been found, the theory sparks a powerful imagination. That thousands of years before Columbus, Phoenician sails may once have cast their shadows across the Atlantic, only to vanish without leaving a clear trace. Whether it was circumnavigating Africa, sailing to Cornwall, or perhaps venturing to more distant shores, what all of these voyages share is a spirit of boldness and extraordinary skill at sea. The Phoenicians did not command great conquering armies, nor did they build sprawling land empires. Instead, they conquered through networks of trade and colonies strung across the waters. Each distant journey brought back not only tin, gold, and ivory, but also stories, symbols, and the spread of culture beyond every visible frontier. In their expansion across the Mediterranean, the Phoenicians did not stop at trading posts or temporary harbors. In some places they built cities, and a few of those cities did not merely survive, but rose to surpass their homeland, becoming powers in their own right. The peak of this process was Carthage, the greatest and longest-lasting Phoenician colony, a name that would one day make even Rome tremble. According to the legend retold by Virgil in the Aeneid, Carthage was founded around 814 before Christ by Queen Dido, also known as Elissa, a princess of Tyre. Forced to leave her homeland after a dynastic dispute, she led her loyal followers across the sea to the Bay of Tunis in North Africa. The famous tale tells how Dido bargained with the locals for as much land as could be covered by a single ox hide. She then cut the hide into thin strips and laid them out in a wide circle, claiming a territory large enough to establish the city of Carthage. Though wrapped in myth, the story reflects the intelligence, boldness, and practical spirit long associated with the Phoenicians. Its name in the Phoenician tongue, Kot Hadasht, meant new city. And indeed, Carthage was like a second Tyre, but placed in a far more favorable position. Located at the very center of the Mediterranean, straddling east and west, it became a natural crossroads for every sea route. The Bay of Tunis offered a safe anchorage, while the surrounding North African lands were far more fertile than the narrow, rugged homeland of Phoenicia. Carthage soon outgrew its role as a colony, transforming into a new hub of Mediterranean commerce. The Phoenicians brought to Carthage all their heritage, shipbuilding, seafaring, artistry, and religion. The temple of Melkart, patron god of Tyre, was raised, making him the supreme deity of the new city. The dye works, glass furnaces, and jewelry workshops continued producing goods that were sought across the sea. Yet Carthage soon revealed itself to be different from its mother cities. Rather than remaining a flexible intermediary, it evolved into a true power of its own. At home, Phoenician cities preserved their autonomy by bowing to the great empires of Assyria, Babylon, or Persia. Carthage, by contrast, lay beyond the direct reach of the Eastern powers. It had space to grow freely. With wealth pouring in through trade, Carthage realized that prosperity must be guarded by strength. They built a powerful fleet, not only for defense, but to dominate sea lanes. From then on, Carthage was no longer just a trading center, but a naval superpower that could rival, and sometimes surpass, Greece and Rome. Carthage did not remain on the defensive. It expanded its reach, seizing Sardinia, Corsica, and much of Sicily, founding colonies in Iberia and controlling the entire stretch of the North African coast. Unlike the old Phoenician model of trading stations, Carthage turned these lands into real territories with governors, taxes, and garrisons. This was the turning point. From a network of trade without borders, Carthage had become a land-based empire with hard power. Its politics reflected that growth. The city kept the system of a council and two chief magistrates called suffet, but it also developed a strong senate, creating a republican model. This structure proved far more stable than the divided and vulnerable mother cities of Phoenicia. In religion, Carthage continued the worship of Melkart, Baal-Hamon, and the goddess Tanit. Yet rituals became harsher. Greek and Roman sources accused Carthage of child sacrifice during times of crisis. Though modern scholars debate how much of this was real and how much was propaganda, it is clear that religion in Carthage was inseparable from politics and war, serving as the spiritual pillar of the empire. From a new city founded by Tyre, Carthage rose to stand as an equal to the greatest powers. When Greece pushed into Sicily, Carthage met them in fierce wars. When Rome emerged, Carthage became its chief enemy, sparking the three legendary Punic Wars. Here, the Phoenician legacy revealed another face, no longer only merchants, but warriors and conquerors. Carthage thus became the living proof of Phoenician continuity and transformation. It showed how the legacy of a trading people could evolve into an imperial power when placed in the right conditions. If Tyre and Sidon embodied the art of skillful commerce, Carthage embodied the ability to turn wealth into hard power. Through Carthage, Phoenicia is remembered not only as merchants but as empire builders who left a lasting mark on Mediterranean history. Before Carthage rose to rival Greece and Rome, the relationship between the Phoenicians and the Greeks had already left a complex imprint. In the vast tapestry of the ancient Mediterranean, few interactions carried as many layers of meaning as the encounters between these two peoples. From the 8th to the 6th centuries before Christ, they met on the seas, trading goods, sharing writing systems, exchanging ideas and artistic motifs, yet also competing fiercely, for both saw the sea as their lifeblood. They were companions in expanding knowledge, but also adversaries upon the waves. The clearest mark of Phoenician influence was writing. Around the 8th century before Christ, the Greeks adopted the Phoenician alphabet. They kept most of its consonantal system, but added vowels to fit their own language. From this, the Greek script was born, becoming the foundation for Latin, Cyrillic, and much of Europe's written tradition. Herodotus himself openly admitted that the Greeks had learned their letters from the Phoenicians. With that, Phoenician writing transcended trade, becoming the very tool through which philosophy, epic poetry, and drama were preserved. The achievements that would shine as the light of Greece art and symbolism also flowed between them. Archaeologists have uncovered Greek sites filled with Phoenician jewelry, ceramics, and reliefs. Motifs such as the four-petal rosette, fertility goddesses, and mythical hybrid creatures all common in Phoenicia, were absorbed into Greek art, reshaped until they felt uniquely Greek. In return, Phoenicia embraced Greek influences, the idealized human form in sculpture, and new techniques in figure painting on pottery. They did not simply trade goods, they exchanged aesthetic languages, blurring the line between Greek art and Phoenician art. Their commercial exchanges were just as vibrant. The Greeks needed Phoenician cedar, purple dye, glass, and shipbuilding know-how. In turn, the Phoenicians imported Greek wine, olive oil, and decorated pottery. Ships from each side often docked in the other's ports, creating a lively web of exchange. Through such contact, the Greeks even learned key navigational skills from the Phoenicians, such as steering by the North Star, a knowledge that gave them confidence to expand their own horizons. Yet closeness always carried rivalry. As the Greeks entered their era of colonization between the 8th and 6th centuries before Christ, they and the Phoenicians repeatedly clashed in contested zones: Sicily, Sardinia, southern Italy, and above all, the resource-rich Iberian coast. In each place, both peoples established settlements or trading posts, sometimes erupting into conflict. To the Greeks, the Phoenicians were skilled merchants, admirable but also elusive, secretive with their sources, and willing to mislead rivals to protect trade monopolies. Greek literature captured this ambivalence. In the Iliad and the Odyssey, Homer mentions the Phoenicians as clever traders, wealthy and capable, but also sly, even deceitful. The Greeks both admired Phoenician craftsmanship and remained wary of their expanding influence. In truth, the Greco-Phoenician relationship stands as a quintessential example of Mediterranean cross-pollination. No civilization grew in isolation. Greece, famous for its philosophy and art, still drew on seeds planted by Phoenicia, its alphabet, its goods, its seafaring skills. And Phoenicia, in turn, absorbed Greek creativity, enriching its already diverse identity. Through this exchange, sometimes cooperative, sometimes competitive, the Mediterranean became a shared space, a grand stage where each civilization added its own note to the symphony of history. But the balance would not last. As Greece grew stronger, especially after defeating Persia in the 5th century before Christ, Phoenicia's position in the east shrank. The old port cities, long accustomed to tribute and diplomacy, now had to survive under the shadow of a new empire where trade still mattered, but military strength carried the final word. And once again, Phoenicia chose the path it knew best, remaining a borderless empire, living by the sea and by commerce rather than by territory. When we think of the word empire, images come to mind of conquering armies, vast stretches of territory, and monumental capitals standing as centers of power. Egypt had the Nile Valley, Assyria ruled the plains of Mesopotamia, Persia commanded the Iranian plateau, stretching all the way to India. But Phoenicia followed a different path. They had no sprawling lands, no massive army, and not even a single capital. And yet they controlled an immense sphere of influence, not through land, but through the sea and through trade. From Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos to Carthage, Cadiz in Spain, Malta, Sicily, and Cyprus, their entire network resembled a shining string of pearls, connected by constant voyages. Whoever controlled this chain held the lifeblood of Mediterranean commerce in their hands. In this network, every Phoenician city was a vital link. No one city imposed absolute rule over the others, but all were bound together by the sea. To land-based empires, this model was baffling. How could a people without centralized territory be so powerful? But their dispersion was their strength. If one city fell, the others endured. If one sea route was blocked, another was opened. There was no single heart for an enemy to strike. This borderless empire of Phoenicia was therefore far more resilient than many realized. The secret was that Phoenician power did not flow from taxes or armies, but from their indispensability to others. Egypt needed cedar wood and ships, Phoenicia supplied them. Assyria demanded ivory, gems, gold, and silver for its palaces, Phoenicia delivered. Greece sought writing, luxury goods, and seafaring knowledge, Phoenicia provided. By becoming the indispensable middlemen, they transformed the dependence of other civilizations into their own source of strength. Because of this, Phoenician rule was never about domination. They did not send armies to conquer, they sent merchants to negotiate. They did not build garrisons, they built trading stations. Their power was invisible, woven into economies, religions, and daily life across the region. A military empire could collapse in a single battle, but a trade network was far harder to erase, for it was built on the natural human need for exchange. Of course, a borderless empire had its limits. When faced with powers built on sheer military force, the Phoenicians could not resist outright. They were compelled to pay tribute to Assyria, Babylon, and Persia, and later they bowed before Alexander the Great. Yet even when conquered politically, they never lost their commercial identity. No matter who ruled, Phoenician ships still sailed, goods still filled their harbors, and Tyrian purple still colored the robes of kings. Military empires came and went, but the commercial empire of Phoenicia endured. This made Phoenicia an exception in the history of the ancient world. They proved that to become a power, vast territory was not essential. To control the roads and to turn connection into power was enough for a small people to shape the course of history. When the Persian Achaemenids rose to dominance, Phoenicia once again displayed its extraordinary adaptability. From a borderless empire built on trade, they transformed into the backbone of the Persian navy, continuing their prosperity within a new world order. The Persians, born from the inland plateau, excelled in cavalry and land warfare, but they were weak at sea. When their empire expanded into the Mediterranean and sought to control the vast expanse stretching from Egypt to Asia Minor, they had no choice but to rely on peoples with a true seafaring tradition, and none were more suited than the Phoenicians. From the reign of Darius I onward, the cities of Tyre, Sidon, Arwad, and Byblos became the backbone of the Achaemenid navy, providing ships, sailors, and even admirals. On the water, Persia's naval strength rested firmly on Phoenician skill and tradition. Their role became most visible during the Greco-Persian Wars. When Xerxes launched his great invasion of Greece in 480 before Christ, crossing the Hellespont on his legendary pontoon bridge, the most elite squadrons of his massive fleet were Phoenician. Even Herodotus, a Greek historian writing from the enemy's perspective, admitted that Phoenician ships surpassed all others in craftsmanship and seamanship. Xerxes, recognizing this, often entrusted Phoenician admirals with the most critical tasks. To the Greeks they were enemies, but they could not deny that at sea the Phoenicians were their most formidable rivals. Yet the disaster at Salamis in 480 before Christ marked a bitter turning point. In that fateful naval battle, the cunning of Themistocles and the agility of the Athenian sailors shattered the Persian fleet in the narrow straits. The Phoenicians, who had supplied the strongest contingent, suddenly became the scapegoats. Greek sources tell us that Xerxes, enraged by defeat, executed several Phoenician commanders in fury. From trusted allies, they became the sacrificial victims of imperial wrath. Still, even after Salamis, Persia could not replace them. From Egypt to Ionia, no other people could match the maritime expertise of Phoenicia. In their dealings with the Achaemenids, the Phoenicians once again displayed their trademark pragmatism. Unlike many conquered lands, they did not rebel. Instead, they accepted the role of subordinate allies, as long as their internal autonomy was preserved. Their port cities remained prosperous, continuing to export cedar wood, glass, and purple dye. Under the shelter of the Persian Empire, they enjoyed stability and protection, while Persia, in turn, relied on their fleets. It was a balanced exchange. Persia needed the sea, and Phoenicia needed the land-based shield of a superpower. Phoenician culture of this period also bore the mark of Persia. Decorative arts, architectural styles, even patterns on clothing found in archaeological sites reveal strong Achaemenid influence. Yet this fusion did not erase Phoenician identity. On the contrary, it showcased their adaptability, the very secret of their survival. Between the stone columns of Persepolis and the temples of Tyre, subtle overlaps can still be seen. A part of Phoenicia had entered the Persian world, and a part of Persia had seeped into Phoenician culture. But that stability did not last. In 332 before Christ, Alexander the Great marched down from Macedonia, shaking the Achaemenid order to its foundations. As Persia crumbled under his advance, Phoenicia was drawn into the fiercest trial of its history, a test that would turn the city of Tyre into the stage for one of the greatest sieges in the annals of warfare. When Alexander the Great launched his campaign against the Persian Empire, Phoenicia became an unavoidable target. The port cities of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos had long been strategic allies of the Achaemenids, and the Phoenician fleet was the backbone of Persian naval power. Alexander understood one thing clearly: to bring Persia to its knees, he first had to control the sea, and to control the sea, he needed to conquer Phoenicia. Among all its cities, Tyre, wealthy, proud, and fortified, stood as the greatest challenge. Tyre was built on an island about 1 kilometer offshore, surrounded by walls rising nearly 150 feet high. With this natural and man-made fortress, Tyre had long been considered the impregnable city. Assyria, Babylon, even Persia itself had tried to subdue it, but achieved little more than symbolic submission. When Alexander marched down the coast, Byblos and Sidon quickly surrendered. But Tyre was different. Its people believed the sea and their towering walls would protect them forever. At first, Alexander did not intend to destroy Tyre. He simply requested entry to make an offering to Melkart, the city's patron god, whom the Greeks identified with Heracles, the hero Alexander revered as a spiritual ancestor. Tyre refused. They would not allow a foreign army to set foot inside their city. That rejection lit the fuse. Alexander resolved to make Tyre his prize. He conceived a plan as bold as it was unprecedented, to build a causeway from the mainland to the island. Tens of thousands of soldiers cut down Lebanon's forests and hauled stones into the sea, slowly extending a massive land bridge toward Tyre's walls. The Tyrians struck back ferociously. Their fleet raided the construction site, setting fire to the works, while defenders hurled rocks and spears from above. The siege turned into a grueling contest, human engineering and persistence against the sea itself and the fierce will of a defiant city. Alexander adapted. He absorbed the fleets of Phoenician cities that had already surrendered, turning former enemies into allies. More than 200 ships from Sidon, Byblos, and Cyprus joined his side, encircling Tyre. The city was cut off completely. After 7 relentless months, the causeway finally reached Tyre's walls. Siege towers and catapults were rolled into place, battering the defenses with fire and stone until a breach opened. The Macedonian army poured through. Street by street, temple by temple, Tyre fought but fell. More than 8,000 were killed. Some 30,000 were sold into slavery. The city was not erased from the map, but its independence, its pride, was gone forever. Tyre, jewel of Phoenicia, had fallen before the steel and determination of a new conqueror. The impact of the siege thundered across the Mediterranean. Alexander had not merely destroyed a city, he had sent a clear message. No fortress was beyond his reach. From that moment, Phoenicia ceased to exist as an autonomous force. Its harbours, once vibrant centres of trade, now served the ambitions of Alexander. Its navy, once the backbone of Persia, became a tool in the conquest of Asia. In the memory of history, the siege of Tyre in 332 before Christ remains one of the greatest feats of siegecraft ever attempted. The causeway Alexander built, though worn down by centuries, still leaves traces on the Lebanese coast today. It stands not only as physical evidence of the battle, but as a symbol of human willpower, unyielding even before challenges that seemed impossible. After the tragic fall of Tyre to Alexander the Great in 332 before Christ, the destiny of Phoenicia entered a new chapter, one in which they no longer held their own voice. For centuries, they had skillfully preserved independence through tribute, trade, and the fragmentation of their port cities. But from this point onward, they had to learn to survive in a world shaped by greater empires. After taking Tyre, Alexander swiftly marched on to Egypt and then pushed his campaigns as far as India. His empire was short-lived, but the wave of Hellenization he unleashed lasted for centuries. Phoenicia, with once brilliant cities like Sidon, Byblos, and Arwad, was drawn into this new order. Under the Seleucid dynasty in Syria and the Ptolemies in Egypt, Phoenicia became little more than coastal provinces, important as intermediaries of commerce, but stripped of political autonomy. Their cities still kept councils, temples, and festivals, yet ultimate authority now rested in the hands of Greek governors appointed by foreign courts. The deepest change came in culture. Greek quickly became the language of administration and trade, gradually replacing Phoenician in everyday life. The Phoenician alphabet, once the very root of Greek writing, was now displaced by its own descendant. It was a bitter paradox. Their greatest gift to the world endured, but no longer carried their name. In the temples, Melkart was still worshipped, but identified as Heracles. Astarte lived on, but under the guise of Aphrodite. Religion, art, and architecture all took on a Hellenistic veneer, leaving Phoenicia both present and fading, surviving only within borrowed forms. Yet even without independence, the Phoenician legacy continued to flow, absorbed by the empires that followed. Tyrian purple became the royal color of Rome, reserved for emperors and senators. Sidonian glass flooded Roman markets, one of the most sought-after products of its age. Phoenician merchants still traveled the seas, but no longer in the name of Tyre or Sidon, now as subjects of Rome. Their presence grew invisible, yet their influence endured. The end of Phoenicia was not a sudden catastrophe, but a gradual dissolving. They did not vanish in the flames of conquest, but slowly faded through the twin processes of Hellenization and Romanization. This made them a paradox of history, a people who profoundly shaped Mediterranean commerce, writing, religion, and culture, yet who slowly disappeared from memory, leaving only scattered traces in the languages, symbols, and goods humanity still uses today. Phoenicia did not burn out like a flame extinguished. It passed on like the light of a lamp, transferred to another torch. When Greece, and later Rome, lit the fire of European civilization, within that flame still glowed the spark of Phoenicia, though their name, at last, slipped into silence. Though Phoenicia's homeland in the east had faded into the empires of Greece and Rome, in the west, Carthage still stood tall, a proud fortress carrying the strongest pulse of the Phoenician legacy. But fate had already written its course. Carthage would face a new power rising from the same Mediterranean world, Rome. On one side stood a mighty trading empire, its strength built on colonies and wealth. On the other, a militarized republic, hardened by endless wars on the Italian peninsula and now ready to expand. When these two civilizations collided, the result was a century of struggle. The three Punic Wars, fought from 264 to 146 before Christ, ending with the complete destruction of Carthage, and with it the last chapter of Phoenician power. The First Punic War, 264 to 241 before Christ, erupted over control of Sicily, a strategic island rich in resources and positioned at the heart of Mediterranean sea routes. Carthage had long dominated the seas, while Rome was only beginning to look beyond Italy. At first, Rome was hopelessly weak on water. Yet here, Rome revealed its defining trait: relentless persistence. By copying and improving Carthaginian ship designs, they built a massive navy. They invented the corvus, a boarding bridge with iron spikes, allowing Roman infantry to turn sea battles into hand-to-hand combat on deck. After nearly 20 years of grueling war, Carthage was exhausted and forced to cede Sicily. Rome now held its first overseas territory. The Second Punic War, 218 to 201 before Christ, was Carthage's most glorious and tragic moment, forever tied to the name of Hannibal Barca. Driven by vengeance against Rome, Hannibal achieved one of the greatest military feats in history, leading an army with war elephants across the snowbound Alps into Italy. Victories like Trasimene and Cannae shook Rome to its core. For a time, it seemed Hannibal might crush the Republic, but Rome proved more resilient than he imagined. Refusing to surrender, they adopted the delaying strategy of Fabius Maximus, stretched the war out, and struck Carthage's supply bases in Spain. At last, in 202 before Christ, Hannibal was defeated at Zama by Scipio Africanus. Carthage was stripped of nearly all overseas lands, forced to limit its army, and burdened with crushing indemnities. For the next 50 years, Carthage clawed its way back through trade. Bound and shackled, it still rebuilt its economy so successfully that Rome grew uneasy. The Roman elder Cato ended every speech with the same refrain: "Carthago delenda est," Carthage must be destroyed. His words were more than rhetoric. They captured a Roman conviction that the Republic could never rest while Carthage still existed. The Third Punic War, 149 to 146 before Christ, was the inevitable conclusion. Rome besieged Carthage for 3 years. The city, though restricted by treaty, fought with desperate courage. New walls were raised under siege, weapons were forged from household items, even women and children joined the defense. But Rome's power was overwhelming. In 146 before Christ, Carthage fell. Over 150,000 inhabitants were killed or sold into slavery. The city was leveled to its foundations. Legend says the Romans sowed salt into the soil so that nothing would grow again, likely a symbolic story, but one that reflects Rome's determination to erase Carthage from both the map and memory. That destruction ended not only Carthage's story, but the final chapter of Phoenicia as an independent political and military force. Their legacy, Tyrian purple, Sidonian glass, and unmatched seafaring, endured, but their names lived on only in history books. In this fateful clash, Rome did not merely defeat a city. It extinguished a seafaring tradition that had carried the Mediterranean for thousands of years. When Carthage was leveled under the Roman sword in 146 before Christ, it seemed that the history of Phoenicia had ended. Yet in truth, Phoenicia never truly disappeared. They simply ceased to exist as an independent political force. The essence of what they created lived on, flowing through the civilizations that followed, becoming an inseparable part of humanity's memory. Their 3 greatest legacies, writing, seafaring, and trade, stand as undeniable proof that a small coastal people could leave a mark far more enduring than many of the mightiest empires. First came writing. The Phoenician alphabet, first emerging around 1200 before Christ, was the direct ancestor of Greek and through it of Latin. Every time we write in English, French, Spanish, Italian, or countless other languages today, we are still using the gift of Phoenicia, a seemingly modest invention with a lifespan of millennia. Next came seafaring. The Phoenicians were the first true masters of the sea in the ancient world. They navigated by the North Star, a skill even the Greeks learned from them. They built ships from cedar wood, joining planks with wooden pegs and rope lashings rather than nails, creating hulls both strong and flexible enough to brave great waves. They sailed long voyages, established trading stations as waypoints, and preserved their knowledge in symbols, rudimentary maps, and oral tradition. Thanks to them, the Mediterranean became, for the first time, a connected space rather than a scatter of isolated shores. In the wake of their ships, we can glimpse the faint outlines of Viking expeditions across the North Atlantic, or the Portuguese caravels that later opened sea routes to India and the Americas. To call Phoenicia the first naval academy of humanity would hardly be an exaggeration. Finally came commerce and finance. The Phoenicians were among the first to make cross-border trade the foundation of survival. Unbound by land, they built power upon connection. Their port cities, Tyre, Sidon, Carthage, were not only harbours but international marketplaces where merchants from all corners of the known world could meet under the protection of gods and laws. In many ways, they planted the seeds for the very idea of the trading city and the global market, later echoed in Venice, Genoa, and Amsterdam. Their principle was strikingly modern. Value lay not only in land, but in networks, in the ability to create exchange across borders. When we fit these three pieces together, we see that Phoenicia gave humanity more than luxury goods or ancient harbours. They left behind a way of thinking and organizing, a way to write to remember, a way to sail to expand horizons, and a way to trade to connect people. These were not fleeting gifts of a short-lived empire. They became part of the very foundations of global civilization. And so, even though the name Phoenicia vanished from maps, they live on in every letter we write, in every international exchange, and in the very idea of the connected world we inhabit today. In the end, Phoenicia proved a simple yet profound truth. Sometimes the most enduring power in history does not come from the sword, but from language, knowledge, and the ability to bring people together. There is a great paradox in human history. A people who once commanded vast sea routes, who created the alphabet that shaped Western languages, who carried Tyrian purple and Sidonian glass to every shore of the Mediterranean, are almost absent from our historical memory. For centuries, the name Phoenicia was rarely spoken, and when it was, it survived only as a faint shadow in the writings of others. How could a civilization that once served as the lifeblood of the ancient world be so thoroughly forgotten? Part of the answer lies in their very nature. Borderless and fragmented, Phoenicia was never a centralized empire with a single capital or a unified dynasty. It existed as a constellation of city-states, Tyre, Sidon, Byblos, Arwad, each with its own god, its own trade network, sometimes cooperating, sometimes competing. So when Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, and Rome rose in turn, Phoenicia did not collapse as a single power. It dissolved piece by piece. There was no dramatic moment like the day Rome destroyed Carthage, no grand epic to record a collective fall. Instead, they slipped from memory quietly, not with a single blow, but with the absence of a shared image. Another reason lies in the nature of their strength. The Phoenicians did not build empires with swords and iron armies. They did not raise colossal monuments to boast of their might. They lived by trade, an activity that leaves wealth but little spectacle. They were the weavers of exchange between Egypt, Mesopotamia, Anatolia, and the wider Mediterranean, but merchants do not inspire the kind of triumphal stories that chroniclers love to write. As a result, Phoenicia had no scenes etched into the collective imagination. No epic battlefield, no immortal temple, only ships quietly cutting across the waves and then vanishing. Their memory was also swallowed up in the language of others. In Assyrian texts, they are mentioned only as tribute from Sidon. In Persian records, they are listed simply as Phoenician sailors in the Achaemenid fleet. In Rome, the Tyrian dye became the imperial purple of the Caesars, no longer tied to its makers. Phoenicia was remembered as Rome's dyer, Greece's merchant, Persia's sailor. The skills and products remained, but the name was erased. And so for many centuries, Phoenicia was pushed into the shadows of history. Only in modern times, with the rise of archaeology, did their presence slowly re-emerge. In Byblos, inscribed stones revealed the alphabet they once spread across the ancient world. In Tyre, submerged harbours and the foundations of Melkart's temple testified to their prosperity. In Sidon, massive carved sarcophagi, especially the famed sarcophagus of Eshmunazar, displayed their craftsmanship and language. Even Carthage, though Rome leveled it to the ground, left behind traces. The foul-smelling dye works, the controversial child cemeteries, the coins stamped with tanit. On the Iberian Peninsula, in Cadiz, Huelva, and even as far as Cornwall, archaeologists have uncovered Phoenician pottery, jewellery, seals, and harbours, proving their reach extended far beyond what official history once admitted. These discoveries have fueled modern debates. Some scholars argue that Phoenicia was forgotten simply because they left no epics or chronicles of their own. Everything we know comes through Greek and Roman eyes often clouded with bias. Others take a stronger view that Phoenicia was deliberately erased from collective memory. A small people, with no empire and no armies, yet commanding the seas and trade routes, this was an uncomfortable truth for empires that saw themselves as the center of power. Once Rome razed Carthage, dimming the memory of Phoenicia also erased the image of a rival that once stood as their equal. And so Phoenicia entered history in the brilliant light of its achievements, only to disappear into the silence of memory. It is only through archaeology and modern scholarship that we can see them again, not as defeated subjects in the words of other empires, but as a civilization that quietly yet profoundly shaped the Mediterranean world. As we close our journey into Phoenicia, a familiar image comes back into view: the sea. Waves still crash against the rocky shores of Tyre, Sidon, and Byblos, as they have for thousands of years. But unlike the past, when merchants hurried along the docks and ships overflowed with cargo, today there remains only the wind and faint traces buried in the earth. The story of Phoenicia did not end with a single decisive battle, but with a slow fading, leaving behind a paradox. Once the axis of the ancient world, yet now little more than a shadow in human memory. And yet that very paradox makes Phoenicia a striking mirror for our own time. They never built a land empire, but for a moment in history, they connected the entire Mediterranean through trade. When those roots broke, through war, through crisis, through the rise of new powers, the very foundations of their existence crumbled. This is not only an ancient story, but also a warning for our modern world, increasingly dependent on global supply chains. A disruption in one distant harbour, the closure of one sea lane, the shortage of one key resource, any of these can shake the economies of dozens of nations, just as a single upheaval in the Mediterranean once left Phoenicia in turmoil. The greatest lesson Phoenicia offers is not only a celebration of their ingenuity, but a clear reminder of the fragility of connection. The larger and more complex a system becomes, the more it requires strong foundations to endure. Phoenicia once linked thousands of miles of coastline, but without a unifying structure to protect and sustain it. When the storms came, Each link broke, and their seemingly unshakable network unraveled with surprising speed. Today, as humanity celebrates its intercontinental trade routes, its digital networks connecting billions, its global markets operating every second, we should remember that Phoenicia once did something similar on an ancient scale. And like them, we too are not immune to crisis. Globalization can be a strength, but it can also become a fatal weakness if we forget resilience. Phoenicia leaves us with a simple yet profound reminder. The power of connection must be matched by the ability to preserve and protect it. Otherwise, the very paths that once carried prosperity may become the same paths that lead to disappearance. Phoenicia, then, is not only a story of the past, it is a mirror reflecting both the pride and the fragility of a connected world. And as we listen to the sound of the waves today, perhaps we can still hear their message. The sea can open endless horizons, but it can also swallow everything if humanity forgets how to safeguard the fragile lifelines it depends upon.